Hi everyone, welcome back. Hopefully everyone has come back. Claire, would you like to share your screen?
Oh yeah.
So our next speaker is Claire Harris. He's going to talk to us about bogs and biomes.
Thanks, Glenn. Hi everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me and see me, and hopefully my dog stays sleeping in the other room and doesn't disturb us. But for anyone that hasn't met me, I'm Claire Harris, and I joined BioSS a couple of years ago, just pre-pandemic, and since then I've been working on a bunch of different things, but primarily these two NERC landscape decisions grants that I'm going to talk about today. So the grants themselves are kind of a three-pronged approach from three different institutions. So myself and Glenn work on this from BioSS. We also have colleagues in the Natural History Museum in London, and also from my old university that I did my PhD in, the University of Glasgow. And we're a group with kind of varied skills, so from ecologists and botanists through to mathematicians, computer scientists, statisticians. And we feel that you really need all of these different approaches in the mix if you're going to be modelling plant biodiversity, which is the kind of focus of our project. And in particular, we're thinking about plant biodiversity in the UK and how we might simulate this so that we can start to decide what might happen to the plants in the UK under different types of climate and land use change, and how we might start to mitigate for those different things. So in particular, we are concerned with plants because at least a quarter of plants are assessed as threatened with extinction by the IUCN sampled red list for plants. But in that assessment, there are so many thousands more species that just don't have sufficient information to even make an assessment. So there is a kind of particular lack of information on plants worldwide, and we thought we might start to try and fill this gap somewhat by coming up with a simulator. And in particular, we were focused on the UK, partially because of these series of grants released by NERC, but also because the data that we have for the UK, so where plants are found, what kinds of different land use are going on, what kind of climates are all quite detailed, so we could start to kind of build these simulators up from scratch. And when we're thinking about plants and climate change, we know that plants are particularly vulnerable because they're kind of limited by how far they can disperse their seeds, and so that might not be as far as their kind of animal counterparts can roam. So that's the kind of the background of the project, and we've got two approaches for this really. So the kind of first project aim is led by the Natural History Museum, and that's really been diving into how we might start to extract information to feed into these kinds of models. And for any good model of plants, we need an idea of how the plants are going to kind of behave and respond in their environment. So we need all of this trait information. And fortunately for us, every kind of recognised plant species should have a taxonomic description attached to it. So our colleagues there have been working on an automated extraction tool using natural language processing, which can pull out some of these traits from different types of literature. And then the second kind of aim was to develop a modelling tool for the UK and hopefully beyond, to incorporate some of this information into it. So when I'm talking about this extraction of the plant traits, I thought I'd just go over that briefly. So for a particular species, and an example here is one we might find in a bog in the UK. So this is cross-leaved heath, and we can search for particular botanical terms that might mean something biologically and mechanistically in a model. So we might search for the term urceolate, which means it has these kind of urn-shaped leaves. And if we know that, then that means that probably they're not going to be insect pollinated, because the insects can't get into these kind of tight urns. And then another word we might find is autogamic, which means they're kind of self-fertilized. So there are all sorts of different terms like this that we can use to build up different pictures of the strategies that plants might use. So that might go from pollination to dispersal to their kind of tolerance to different types of environmental change. And so we're in the position now where we have some good results on this for 30 priority species in the UK, and particularly we've been thinking about UK peatland species. And we need to take these traits that have come from numerous places, so taxonomic descriptions, literature and journal articles, UK flora, for example, and put them into some kind of form that's useful for our models. And the model itself is where I come in. So this is a model that I developed during my PhD in Glasgow, and I've been very lucky to be able to take this forward into these next two grants. So we ended up calling it Ecosystem, which stands for Ecosystem Simulation through Integrated Species Trait Environment Modelling, which is a bit of a mouthful. But essentially, we are kind of breaking down these plant ecosystems into grids. So you can see on the left here, we have a kind of big grid of the landscape. And within each grid cell, we have individuals of different plant species that are living and dying and interacting with one another. And if they survive, they might reproduce and disperse their seeds across the landscape, and this whole thing happens as a stochastic cycle. And there are lots of different attributes of the environment that might determine how these mechanisms happen. Things like climate and what available resources like sunlight and water there are locally, and those things will dynamically change over time. And then the species themselves have these different traits I was talking about that make them more or less well adapted for the situation in which they find themselves. So it might be preference for a particular environment, it might be how much water they need, it might be how far they can disperse. And so we're hoping that we can really start to drive some of these mechanisms with real information on real species from the Natural History Museum data. So thinking again about the UK, we have kind of scaled this model now to incorporate the kind of roughly 1,800 plant species of the UK at 1 kilometre resolution. And I've been thinking a lot in the past year or so of how to incorporate different types of data. So that might be on climate or soil or land use, and how to really develop the mechanics of the model so that these interactions and dynamics are more realistic. And there are kind of two future potential directions we saw this going in when we applied for the grant. The first of which being peatlands. So we know that in Scotland, peatlands are very important. They make up quite a large percentage of the country and hold a kind of whopping amount of carbon. And really we wanted to think about how can we represent the vegetation of peatlands in a model like this, and how it might respond to, say, different mitigation strategies. And then the other strand was thinking about kind of disease, plant disease and an invasion. And thanks to the kind of pandemic over the last couple of years, we have developed quite a large epidemiological component to the model that I won't really talk about today, but that we're kind of working on becoming integrated with the biodiversity part to start to answer questions for the Plant Health Centre. And so as we're kind of stepping forward now, we're thinking about, you know, can we take a specific real life example and start to add in some of this trait data and the new mechanisms that we'll need from this trait data. And so we have some links actually with a site in Wales, which is where I'm from. And this in the picture is Cors Focno, or Borth Bog. It's a raised bog on the coast here, and you'll see that it's quite a unique site because they're worried about kind of inundation of salt water from the sea. There's been, you know, historically some drainage and then some restoration activities, and also quite a lot of different research into the site and what vegetation and other things are there, as well as kind of climate monitoring, etc. So I talked quite a bit about this trait data, and now we're at the point where we think, you know, we've got the data, what are we going to do with it? And there are quite a lot of different things that we could start to look at, and a couple of the areas that we've narrowed down on, I'll go through now. So there is quite a lot of information on dispersal in this new data set. So we can think about the seeds themselves, the plants themselves, you know, how tall are they? So how far are they to going to disperse their seeds? If they're windborne, are they spread by animals like birds? And we can start to kind of incorporate these different pieces of information together. So just in the top right is a little GIF of a wind dispersal kernel that takes into account what the wind speed is currently, how tall the plant is compared to the rest of the plants around it, and information on the seed itself and how far it's likely to be carried. Another really important part of the modelling process will be thinking about the kind of life history of the different plants in the model. So we know that plants don't just drop their seeds and then immediately become a new plant. There are many stages in between. And so we've been thinking about how we might start to go from, you know, a seedling to a sapling to a mature plant that can actually produce new seed for the future. And so on the kind of bottom right, you can see a kind of two-stage system in which the mosses have a kind of juvenile and adult stage, and the shrubs also have a juvenile and adult stage. And then we can finally think about the tolerance of the different species in the model to different environments. So what happens if we start to dry things out, for example? And so we've been looking at very simple scenarios to start with, in which we dry things out and all of the mosses start to die off, and the shrubs start to take over. And then we can make an intervention like they might make in real life and say, actually, we're going to start re-wetting this area again over time. And we can sort of start to see a bit of an extinction debt in the shrub, which grows and then starts to drop off as the moss really takes off again. So all of these dynamics put together, we kind of need to be able to model this or any site And I called this a talk from bogs to biomes, and I use the word biome loosely because I needed another B word to complement the bog. But really, so far we've been thinking about, I suppose, 3 kind of different scales. So the first on the left that I've been talking about now, these kind of really quite fine scale bog sites, and we can start to use different pieces of information from there, like really fine scale elevational data, etc. And then in the middle, we've kind of got our intermediate scale, which I talked about before, which is thinking about the UK on a sort of 1 kilometre grid. And obviously that involves lots of different habitats, lots of different types of land use, and in some ways more, and then also less complexity than the bog example. And then finally on the right is our kind of most extreme scale that I was looking at towards the end of the PhD, which is kind of continent level, and we were modelling Africa and South America at the time. And obviously these are a lot coarser because the information you can find on plant distributions is a lot coarser, as well as the climate data itself. Yeah, so let's see what I have left. Yeah, so I was thinking a little bit about kind of what we need to take things forward. So just as a kind of little refresher at the start, I think I flashed up the ecosystem model and was saying that, you know, within these ecosystems, we have the species interacting with one another and their environment. We have different types of environmental change going on, and we've also got really fine scale kind of population processes as well in the background. And so there are many different things that we need to be able to do this well, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but starting off with our biggest requirement is data, obviously. And you know, we need that information to start to parameterize the models in the first place. So as such as the data I talked about on the plants themselves, where they're found, what their abundances are like, and how that's changed over time. So we can get some kind of historical baselines, information on their traits, which we're now kind of getting access to through these new mechanisms. And then also the kind of habitat and environment itself. So we need detailed fine scale historical data on climate and land use, as well as future projections and different scenarios that that we might need to run these plants through. And the list is kind of endless about what we could be putting in. The second point I wanted to think about was model validation and fitting, and I think Adam made a good case for you know, how important this is in statistical ecology earlier, and I think this is a really big area in which we need to be able to develop in the future. So, you know, can we think about different ways to estimate parameters that we're not going to be able to get from the data? Can we come up with ways to fit such a complicated model to kind of historical case studies of data, for example? Then what I've kind of touched upon today is what different mechanisms do you need to add in to make things realistic, and it's kind of the classic age-old thing of you know, you want it to be as simple as possible but no simpler. So we've really had quite a lot of back and forth with the botanists on this project, and thinking about you know, what are the essential processes that we really need to be a part of a model like this. And then finally, none of this that we've done so far would have been possible without the kind of computational advances we've had in recent years. So that's both in kind of terms of hardware and software. A lot of this, mostly all of the code, was written in Julia. We've kind of worked hard to ensure that it can parallelize over things like high performance clusters, because some of these simulation examples have so many thousands of species and such broad areas that you kind of need really big devices with really big memory to be able to pull them off. And I think that's kind of getting better and better, that situation for us all the time, which is exciting. Yeah, and then finally, I guess for the future of these projects, we're kind of open to this being applied to lots of different problems. We've got plans, hopefully, for taking this forward into the next RESAS programme, and but we'd be really interested to hear from other people as well. So yeah, please get in touch if you've got any questions or any queries about this. But I think I'm probably approaching my time, so I'll stop there, and thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you very much, Claire. Great talk. Any questions from the virtual floor? One comment I was going to make was, it sometimes feel like you were talking about there being a bit of back and forth with the botanists on model complexity. It often feels more like fourth and fourth to me, in the sense that we're always being asked to add things in, but that's simply because things are very complicated.
Yeah, I think there's possibly like no limit on the amount of things that we could add in. So yeah, it is a bit like that at the moment, but I'm hoping anyway that we kind of reach this plateau where we think like, actually we've got all the kind of main things, but yeah, there's always an exception to every rule. So that's what I've learned from working with plants so far.
Or three, yeah.
Oh, I think Mark might have his hand up.
I did, thank you. And I can unmute myself now. I've got the power now. Can I just ask about? I mean, you're talking about different scales. Some of the, as you mentioned, you're working right from continent scale right down to smaller scale, local scale. I mean, how does the availability of data match up with plans to amalgamate all these different scales?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I'd say that our kind of best level for data is the kind of intermediate, so this kind of UK scale. But when you're starting to go down smaller than that, then you need quite detailed site information. And if you're going bigger than that, then you need more detailed information on where the plants are found, which is often quite lacking. So yeah, I think there's probably quite a lot of opportunity for kind of a statistical methodology being developed to help us kind of cope with that. I guess we've been quite lucky so far on the small scale end of things that we've got kind of contact now with the people that work regularly on this site. So they've got quite a lot of kind of information historically on what plants are found there, and a lot of knowledge they can share with us. But yeah, going to the kind of broader end of the scale, it is pretty difficult.
Great, thanks, Claire. I think Ken's got a question now, but he can unmute himself.
Yeah, hi, Claire. That was really interesting. Thanks very much. My question is, and maybe you said this and I overlooked it, do you tend to model at each species individually, or do you do much sort of clustering or grouping of the different kinds of species? Because I imagine some sort of hierarchy going on here where you could say, well, we'll treat these particular plants or groups of species very similar, but allow for a little bit of individual variation within each group. So I guess my question is sort of how much sort of grouping or clustering do you do?
Yeah, so at the moment it runs on the kind of species level rather than really right down to the individual. But you can set it so that different species all have the same kind of traits, and therefore it's being clustered up at a kind of higher level. So but yeah, I think we're quite fortunate so far to be able to have some of this detailed trait information to take it at least down to the species level. But yeah, I think probably the kind of individual based stuff, given some of the scales might be difficult for us to achieve just yet.
Can you say something about the phylogenetics aspect of the work? Because I think that relates to that question.
Yeah. Do you mean in terms of like the gap filling? Or...
Yeah.
So we've been thinking about how to extract information on different traits. So not just the pure traits themselves, but also kind of what climates the plants like based on where they're found. And so we've got a lot of this information together, but obviously it's quite gappy. So we've been thinking about using phylogenetic trees and the relationships between species to start to fill some of these things in. So we can start to say, you know, these species are in the same genus, and we've picked up a strong phylogenetic signal, so in this particular trait, so we can kind of expect that it will have similar kind of values to its counterparts. So yeah, there's potentially a kind of use for using the evolutionary relationships between species to kind of, I suppose, cluster them together a little bit like that.
Great, thanks. I think David's got a question. Sorry, David, I did see your question, but you got gazumped.
I'm interested in the kind of trait space that species occupy. Are there some combinations of traits that are currently favoured? Is that likely to change? And I guess from an evolutionary perspective, then is it likely that vegetation communities will change because of species compositions changing, or are we likely to see evolution in the species, individual species themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't think that's one that we could probably answer at the moment, because I think there are some quite complex kind of interplays between the traits and yeah, whether the kind of trait space is changing like on this individual level, like you say, or more in terms of the groups themselves. But it would be really interesting to see if we can start to get at that with these simulations. And we haven't worked in like a lot of the evolutionary aspect into these models yet. And that's something that I'd be keen to see in the future, definitely.
So yeah, just to jump in there is another project that three of us in BIOS are involved in, Stephen Cattrall and Chris Pooley, looking at with CEH, looking at the evolution of tree species in particular, because the idea being there's quite a lot of standing variation that could be acted on under climate change in particular to sort of help these communities sort of adapt to climate change. And the idea seems to be from the silviculturalist is that there is quite a lot of variation and adaptability within the population already. So I think that's a partial answer to that question, David. Anyway, in the interest of time, I think we should move on to our third presentation, which is from Ken Newman on state-space models. And sorry, thank you. I should have also said thank you very much to Claire for her talk.